What does it take to revolutionize an industry? For one watchmaker on this list, it took 25 years of being ignored by the Swiss establishment before his design became the backbone of Omega's entire modern catalog. For another, it cost them their entire business. The luxury watch world wants you to focus on shiny dials and celebrity ambassadors, but underneath the surface lies a shadow history of brilliant minds whose engineering made modern timekeeping possible. Today, we are dissecting 7 watches built by geniuses. We'll be tracking their breakthroughs and why the most famous watches in the world owe everything to people you've never heard of. Number 7. HYT H1. Picture a watch with no hands for the hours. Instead, a thread of glowing green liquid crawls around the dial hour by hour, pushed by a pair of bellows hidden under the case, like a tiny mechanical heartbeat. That's the HYT H1. When it appeared in 2012, most of the watch world assumed it was a gimmick. It wasn't. 2 fluids, one water-based and tinted fluorescent green, one oil-based and clear. They are inside a hand-blown glass tube coated 7 separate times so the liquid never sticks or smears on its way around the dial. A standard mechanical movement, ticking at a normal 4 Hz, drives a pair of tiny bellows that push the fluid forward through the day and pull it back at 6 o'clock each evening, like a tide resetting itself. HYT wasn't founded by watchmakers chasing tradition. It was founded by 3 engineers, Patrick Berdoz, Lucien Vuillemose, and Emmanuel Savios, who ran a microfluidics company called Pressiflex that built precision fluid systems for medical devices, the kind used to dose treatments in hospitals where a fraction of a milliliter matters. They knew how to move tiny, exact amounts of liquid through a tube without leaking or bubbling. They didn't know how to build a Swiss movement, so they hired Bruno Moutarlier, the former industrial director at Audemars Piguet, and brought in Jean-François Mojon's engineering house, Chronode, to solve a problem that had haunted fluid timekeeping since the Egyptians first tried it with water clocks, keeping liquid moving at a perfectly constant rate without a single drop drifting off schedule. That collaboration alone is worth pausing on. A medical device company and a haute horlogerie engineering house had almost no shared vocabulary at the start. One side spoke in milliliters and viscosity curves. The other spoke in escapements and joule counts. Getting both languages into the same tiny case took years before either side even agreed on what problem they were actually solving, let alone how small a margin of error the finished watch could tolerate on a moving wrist. And here's the part that should have killed the whole project. A wristwatch heats up on your arm. It cools down in a drawer overnight. Liquid expands and contracts with temperature in a way gears and springs simply don't, and in the earliest prototypes, the fluid drifted slightly off the hour mark every time the watch came off the wrist. Fixing that meant redesigning the chemistry of 2 completely different liquids, so their density and thermal expansion behaved identically across a temperature range no clockmaker had ever had to plan for. It cost HYT roughly 2 extra years before the watch was ready to sell. Honestly, I'm not sure any other watch on this list solved a problem this strange. Most complications fight friction or gravity. HYT fought thermodynamics, inside a tube half a millimeter wide. Watch one in person, and the effect is closer to biology than horology. The green fluid doesn't jump or tick the way a normal hour hand does. It creeps, almost breathes, the way blood moves through a vein if you could somehow see it from outside the skin. Early buyers described showing it to friends who simply couldn't tell for the first few seconds whether they were looking at a malfunction or a miracle. That confusion was, in a strange way, the entire sales pitch. Then the company that built it went bankrupt. Not because the watch failed. The pandemic gutted their boutique network almost overnight. Sales collapsed by 40% in a single year. And the shareholders, who would have needed to inject another 5 to 10 million francs, said no. HYT folded in March of 2021. The technology didn't die with it. New ownership bought the assets later that year, and Pressiflex, the fluid engineering outfit that started it all, kept servicing every H1 already on a wrist, because the liquid inside still needed a caretaker even after the brand that made it stopped existing. There's a specific kind of irony sitting inside that story. A watch nobody thought was physically possible outlived the company that proved it could be done. The people who figured out how to make liquid tell time couldn't figure out how to survive a bad quarter. Somewhere, A collector who bought an H1 back in 2013 still checks the tube each morning like a tide chart, half expecting it to have drifted while they slept. It never has. Have you ever seen an HYT in person? Tell me below. HYT bent the laws of fluid dynamics to build a watch. The next one bent the laws of good taste, on purpose, and somehow made it work. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Number 6. Naoya Hida & Co. NH Type 3A. There's a workshop in the Ningyocho district of Tokyo where a moon phase display gets hand-engraved by a man who used to carve jewelry for Tiffany. The watch it ends up on will never appear in a single Rolex forum thread, because almost nobody outside a small circle of collectors has ever heard of the brand that makes it. Naoya Hida spent over 3 decades in sales and marketing for brands like Breguet, Vacheron Constantin, and FP. During before he decided he'd rather build the watch he actually wanted than keep selling other people's. In 2018, he founded his own company with watchmaker Kosuke Fujita, who trained at Tokyo's Hiko Mizuno watchmaking school and later worked inside Seiko's own service labs, and engraver Keisuke Kano, who spent years cutting fine details for Tiffany before joining the team. 3 men, 1 workshop. A shared obsession with watches from the 30s and 40s, the golden age before mechanical design got loud. The Type 3A isn't trying to reinvent anything. That's the point. It's a 37mm dial watch with a hand-engraved moon phase, built with the kind of restraint that makes most modern luxury watches look like they're shouting. The typography, the proportions, the curve of the lugs, every choice traces back to a specific decade of watchmaking that most brands have forgotten existed. Fujita has said the team spent enormous stretches of time on balance and detail alone, adjusting a font by fractions of a millimeter until it finally felt right. None of that restraint comes cheap to produce. The movements underneath are heavily reworked third-party calibers, stripped down and rebuilt with the kind of high-precision micro-machining more commonly associated with aerospace parts than dress watches, then finished by hand on top of that. It's a strange combination. Factory-grade tooling married to a craftsman's patience, aimed entirely at making a watch look like it was never trying that hard in the first place. Here's the thing nobody expects from a brand this quiet. The production runs are almost absurdly small. Some references are limited to 15 pieces total. Hida has said he wants his watches to last forever, but knows some might simply vanish along with the people who owned them, unremarked, the way most beautiful objects eventually do. That's not false modesty. It's the actual business model. Naoya Hida doesn't chase hype cycles or celebrity wrists. The brand grows one relationship at a time, through conversations with the people who eventually buy the watches. Conversations Hida has said feed directly back into the design itself. Collectors online have started calling the brand's aesthetic the Japanese answer to Philippe Dufour. Not because the watches look alike, but because both operate on the same stubborn premise. Finishing and proportion matter more than any complication you could bolt onto a dial. So no marketing budget exists to spread that comparison. It travels the old-fashioned way, from one collector explaining the appeal to another over coffee, which is exactly the pace Hida seems to want. Which raises an odd question worth sitting with. Is a watch this carefully made, this deliberately unadvertised, actually worth less because almost nobody's heard of it? Or is the obscurity the whole point, the thing that makes it feel like it was made for you specifically and not for an Instagram feed? A collector in Osaka once described putting on his Type 3A for the first time as the feeling of finding a watch his grandfather might have worn, except it was made the week before he bought it. If you'd never heard of a brand on this list before today, which one? Drop it below. Let's move on. Number 5. Romain Gauthier Logical 1. A chain made of rubies, thinner than a shoelace, wound around a snail-shaped cam. That's the heart of the Logical 1. And it exists because Romain Gauthier refused to accept that a 400-year-old idea couldn't be fixed. The problem goes back to the fusee and chain, a mechanism invented in the 15th century to solve a basic flaw in every mainspring. It delivers strong torque when fully wound and weak torque as it runs down, which means the watch runs fast early and slow late unless something compensates. The traditional fix was a conical pulley, the fusée, connected to the barrel by a tiny chain, so the leverage increased exactly as the spring's power decreased. Beautiful in theory, miserable in practice at wristwatch scale because the angled chain rubbed and the tiny links were fragile enough to snap under normal use. Gauthier grew up in the Vallée de Joux, the valley where most of Switzerland's finest watchmaking talent has trained for 2 centuries, machining precision parts before he ever built a complete watch of his own. Philippe Dufour, the closest thing the modern watch world has to a patron saint of finishing, encouraged him early on to build something that didn't just look beautiful, but actually solved a real mechanical problem. So, instead of copying the traditional cone, Gauthier replaced it with a flat, snail-shaped cam sitting on the same plane as the mainspring barrel. Force now travels in a straight line instead of at an angle. The chain shrank to roughly 136 sturdy components, 4 to 5 times fewer than a comparable traditional fusée chain, each link riding on a tiny ruby to cut friction to almost nothing. And because a fusée mechanism can't be wound the normal way, since the chain has to travel in a single direction without slack, Gauthier designed a push-button winding system instead of a crown, an idea nobody else in modern watchmaking had seriously attempted. The logical one launched in 2013 and won the top complication prize at the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie de Genève that same year. Not bad for an independent watchmaker who'd spent the previous 3 years working almost entirely alone in a small workshop, telling almost nobody what he was building. What gets missed in most write-ups is the size of the achievement relative to the size of the team. Long has an army of watchmakers and centuries of institutional memory behind its own chain and fusée pieces. Gauthier had himself, a handful of specialists, and a stubborn refusal to accept that historically difficult meant permanently unsolved. Leonardo da Vinci sketched an early version of the fusée gear system centuries before anyone found a way to make it reliable at wristwatch scale. Lang and Sohn and Ferdinand Berthoud eventually cracked their own versions, both backed by deep institutional resources most independents can only dream about. Gauthier built his alone, in a small workshop, without the safety net of a parent conglomerate to absorb a failed prototype. If the snail cam hadn't worked, there was no larger company to fall back on and try again next year, he once said, describing the moment he finally watched the chain move smoothly around his redesigned cam for the first time, that it felt less like an invention and more like something that should have existed all along, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. Servicing one today still requires a watchmaker trained specifically on that chain, since a single mismatched ruby link can throw off the entire constant force delivery, a level of specialization most repair shops simply don't carry. One watchmaker spent years perfecting a single mechanism. This next brand built 2 complete movements just so they could argue with each other until they agreed. Number 4. Armstrong Mirrored Force Resonance. 2 entirely separate watch movements, each with its own barrel, its own gear train, its own escapement, sit side by side inside a single case. They don't share power. They don't share a regulator. And yet within minutes of being wound, they start ticking in perfect lockstep, like 2 strangers who fall into the same walking pace without either of them noticing. This is resonance, a physical phenomenon first documented by Christian Huygens in the 17th century, when he noticed 2 pendulum clocks hanging on the same wall would eventually synchronize their swing through nothing but faint vibration passing between them. Huygens was sick in bed at the time, watching the 2 clocks from his pillow, and assumed at first that he was imagining it. He wasn't. Watchmakers have chased that effect on the wrist for decades since, mostly by placing 2 balance wheels close enough together that vibrations traveling through the case itself could nudge them into sync. It works, sort of. It's also unreliable, because a case is a clumsy, inefficient way to transmit a signal that delicate. Armstrong, the Swiss house co-owned by Serge Michel and master watchmaker Claude Greisler, took a different approach entirely. Instead of relying on vibrations bouncing loosely through the case, they engineered a physical connector, a single piece of steel called the resonance clutch spring, patented and shaped to sit directly between the 2 balance springs and transfer their energy back and forth on purpose. The two balances start out oscillating slightly out of step. Within minutes, the clutch spring pulls them into harmonic resonance, locked to the same rhythm, and they stay there. Here's the part that should sound impossible. This actually makes the watch more accurate, not less. Two mechanisms correcting each other in real time average out small rate errors that would otherwise accumulate independently. It's not a party trick. It's a chronometric strategy, borrowed from marine chronometer design of the Golden Age, shrunk down to fit on a wrist. You can watch it happen too. A pusher at 2 o'clock resets both running seconds' hands to 0 at once, so the owner can watch the two systems fall back into step with each other in real time. A private demonstration nobody else in the room will understand the significance of. Current editions run to roughly 82,000 francs, limited to as few as 15 or 50 pieces depending on the finish, which puts the mirrored force resonance well below the 7- and 8-figure pieces elsewhere on this list. It's arguably the most accessible, truly novel mechanism most collectors will ever get to own. I keep coming back to this one, honestly. Most complications solve a problem you didn't know you had. This one recreates, on purpose and in miniature, a phenomenon a Dutch physicist stumbled onto by accident, just staring at two clocks on a wall. Somewhere in a workshop in Biel, an engineer still watches the 2 seconds hands drift back into sync every time a new mirrored force resonance comes off the bench, and still finds it a little bit magic. Would you rather own a watch that's beautiful or one that's this technically strange? Comment below. And now number 3. Number 3. Sven Andersson's perpetual secular calendar. Every perpetual calendar watch you've ever seen has a hidden flaw, and almost none of their owners know it exists. A standard perpetual calendar treats every year divisible by 4 as a leap year. That's the rule most of us learned in school, and it's incomplete. The Gregorian calendar, adopted in 1582, added a correction. Century years, not divisible by 400, don't get a leap day. The year 2000 was a leap year. The years 2000, 100, 2000, 200, and 2300 will not be, even though all three are divisible by 4. Every perpetual calendar sold today, including watches costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, will quietly display February 29 in 2100 and be wrong. Someone will need to correct it by hand. Sven Andersson decided that was unacceptable. He'd spent nearly a decade in Patek Philippe's Grand Complications workshop through the 70s before striking out on his own, and in 1996, working independently under his own name, he built a wristwatch that accounts for the full 400-year cycle. A wheel inside the movement rotates once every 4 centuries, tracking not just the ordinary leap year, but the secular exception on top of it. So the watch already knows, decades in advance, that 2100 gets 28 days in February and 2400 gets 29. Think about what that actually means. Andersson built a mechanism to correctly execute a calendar rule that won't matter to a single living owner. Nobody who buys this watch will be alive to see it prove itself. The wheel just sits there, patiently correct, waiting for a date that's still decades away. And it's not marketed as an heirloom piece. Not really. Fewer than 30 were ever made, most in a compact 40mm case that gives no visual hint of what's happening underneath. Flip it over, and a second dial on the case back shows the actual mechanics at work. A 4-year subdial tracking ordinary leap years, and a slower hand sweeping across a 50-year scale that only completes a full rotation once every 4 centuries. Andersson stayed in contact with his former colleagues at Patek Philippe even after leaving, and was reportedly consulted when the brand later built its own secular calendar into the record-setting caliber 89. He didn't patent the idea to keep it exclusive, he just built it quietly because the math bothered him, and he happened to be one of the very few people on Earth capable of solving it. So, what does a mechanism like this actually buy you? Not accuracy you'll ever notice. Not a feature you can show off at a dinner party without a lengthy explanation first. What it buys is a small, stubborn act of correctness for its own sake, engineered by a man who apparently couldn't stand the idea of a calendar that was almost right. To this day, only a small handful of watches in the entire history of the craft have solved this exact problem. Patek Philippe's Caliber 89, Franck Müller's Eternitas Mega 4, and Andersson's own creation. One of those three came from an independent watchmaker working largely alone, without a factory of specialists behind him, which makes the achievement considerably harder to explain away as simply a matter of resources. There's something almost funny about it. The most technically accurate calendar mechanism most people will ever see will only prove itself correct to a great-grandchild who has no idea who Sven Anderson was. One man built a watch for a century he'll never see. The next brand built one watch for a single client and refused to tell anyone who he was. Number 2. Vacheron Constantin, reference 57260. In September of 2015, Vacheron Constantin unveiled a pocket watch with 57 separate complications packed into a white gold case, roughly the size of a small orange. It remains, by most measures, the single most complicated mechanical object ever built by human hands, and the man who paid for it has never been named. The commission came in 2007 from an anonymous American collector who reportedly gave Vacheron's bespoke division, the Atelier Cabinotiers, a brief that amounted to a dare: build the most technically advanced timepiece in the world. Full stop, no ceiling mentioned. 3 watchmakers, Jean-Luc Perrin and brothers Mika and Yannick Pintus, spent the next 8 years designing and hand-assembling the result almost entirely from scratch, 2,800 components. Every one of them finished, beveled, and decorated by a single master watchmaker, because splitting that work across multiple hands would have introduced inconsistencies a project this precise couldn't tolerate. The complication list reads like a dare that got out of hand. A triple-axis tourbillon, a 5-gong grande and petite sonnerie that chimes the hour, quarter, and minute on demand. A double retrograde split-seconds chronograph capable of timing 2 separate events at once. Not 1 but 3 perpetual calendars running simultaneously, including a Hebrew calendar synced to a completely different lunar cycle than the Gregorian mechanism sitting beside it. A star chart, a world timer. A hidden mechanism concealing the alarm's winding crown so cleanly the case looks seamless until you know exactly where to press. Before the 57260, the record for most complications in a single watch belonged to Patek Philippe's Caliber 89. Unveiled in 1989 with 33 complications and roughly 1,728 components, itself built to mark the brand's own 150th anniversary. Vacheron didn't edge past that record. It nearly doubled it, and did so working entirely in white gold on a case built to survive being handled for decades rather than displayed once and locked away, at least in theory. Here's the detail that gets lost every time this watch comes up. Nobody, including Vacheron itself, will confirm what it cost. Estimates from people who were reportedly in the room during the unveiling range from $8 to $10 million, and even that might be conservative for a piece built essentially at whatever cost the client was willing to bear. But the astonishing part isn't the price tag nobody can confirm. It's that this watch will likely spend its entire existence unseen. Because the client demanded total anonymity, there's a real chance the single most complicated mechanical object ever built already sits in a vault somewhere, never worn, never photographed again. It's 2,800 hand-finished components, ticking in total isolation for an audience of exactly one person who doesn't want to be found. That's the real story underneath the specifications. Every other watch on this list exists to be seen, worn, understood, even loved by strangers who'll never own one. This one might be the opposite. The greatest technical achievement in the history of the craft, built specifically so almost nobody would ever get to look at it. Somewhere, 3 watchmakers who spent 8 years of their careers on a single object have no idea if it's still running. Perrin and the Pintus brothers moved on to other projects long ago. None of them, as far as anyone knows, has ever been invited back to see it wound. That watch was built to disappear. The last one on this list was built to survive its own inventor, and it did, inside a company he never fully trusted. Number 1. George Daniels' Space Traveler's Watch. Right now, somewhere on your wrist or a friend's, there's a good chance a small mechanical part called the coaxial escapement is quietly doing its job. Millions of Omega watches have shipped with it since 1999. Almost none of the people wearing them could tell you who invented it, or that he built it almost entirely alone, by hand, in a workshop on the Isle of Man, decades before any factory agreed to touch it. George Daniels spent his life obsessed with a single unsolved problem: the standard lever escapement, the mechanism nearly every mechanical watch on Earth has used since the 18th century. requires constant lubrication and slowly degrades as that lubrication breaks down. George Daniels believed there had to be a better way, and in 1974, working from an obscure 19th century design by an American named Charles Fasselt that almost nobody else had studied closely, he built something new. An escapement using 2 coaxial wheels instead of 1, engineered so the impulse could be delivered with dramatically less friction and, eventually, no lubrication at all. Nobody wanted it. Daniels showed the design around the Swiss industry throughout the 70s. Doors closed. The watch world, in the middle of the quartz crisis, had far bigger problems than an eccentric Englishman's escapement theory. And besides, roughly 200 other attempts to replace the lever escapement had already failed across the previous 2 centuries, going back to a design Thomas Mudge invented in 1754. Patek Philippe showed brief interest in 1981, building a single prototype pocket watch and a single wristwatch around the idea before quietly setting it aside. So, Daniels did what he always did when the industry ignored him. He built the proof himself and fitted the escapement into several of his own watches first, including his own flagship Grand Complication, to prove it could survive daily wear before anyone else was asked to trust it. That proof was the Space Traveler, a pocket watch he began in 1979 and finished in 1982, made almost entirely with his own hands, including a sidereal time train tracking the movement of stars alongside ordinary solar time, plus a moon phase display accurate enough to satisfy an astronomer. He completed roughly 23 pocket watches and a small handful of wristwatches across his entire career, spending an estimated 2,500 hours on each one. This is not a company. This was a single, stubborn man proving a point nobody had asked him to prove. Here's the moment worth sitting with. A teenager at the Manchester School of Horology once watched Daniels give a talk and show off the Space Traveler, and it changed the course of his life on the spot. That teenager was Roger Smith. It took him 7 years and 2 rejected prototypes before Daniels finally accepted him as an apprentice, the only one he ever formally trained, and Smith would go on to help finish Daniels' final unfinished pocket watch after his death in 2011, ensuring the coaxial escapement he'd fought for his entire life reached its last, posthumous expression. Omega finally licensed the design in 1999, 25 years after Daniels first built it, and industrializing it took years of friction between a man who hand-finished every component himself and a factory built to produce a movement millions of times over. It worked. Today, it's likely that more than 1 million Omega watches carry an escapement, one obsessive Englishman invented to solve a problem nobody in the industry believed was worth solving. Recognition arrived late, and mostly at the very end of his life. Daniels was named a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2010, a year before he died, honored by his own country. For an invention, the Swiss industry had spent 2.5 decades politely declining. By then, Omega's coaxial movements were already the backbone of its entire modern catalog, quietly proving the point he'd been unable to prove any other way. In 2019, the original Space Traveler sold at auction for £3,615,000, north of $4.5 million including fees. But the real number worth remembering isn't that one. It's the one sitting on your wrist, or your neighbor's, ticking away with a mechanism built by a man whose name most owners will never learn, because the watch outlived the need to remember who made it. Which mechanism on this list would you most want to see in person? Let me know in the comments. Like for more videos on hidden gems like this, and subscribe.